Good afternoon, or bore da, as we say in Wales. Don't ask me to say any more Welsh, because I don't know much, actually. But National Museum of Wales has 7 sites across Wales, and we deal with the industrial heritage, so there's coal mining, there's slate splitting museum, and I work here at the main museum, which is situated in Cardiff. We have a fantastic art collection, but also in the building we have natural sciences collection, so we have geology, zoology, botany as well. But the art collection has about 35,000 works of art on paper, from 16th century up to yesterday, basically. What I'm going to talk to you about today doesn't really involve any great scientific analysis or indeed any great techniques which we've just experienced and heard about. I basically want to comment on an observation that I have made, which hopefully you can all file it away, and you'll be able to recognize this when you next see it. This is the watercolour in question. It arrived at Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museum Wales, in 2010. It was framed when it arrived in as part of a bequest. It quickly became known from the curators and the collection manager as the glittery goats. And you'll experience that in the next slide. When I first saw it, I just thought it looked too clean and too bright, and I quickly decided that it had probably been treated. And the sky was just too blue, and the clouds are too white, and across the surface was this light dusting of transparent material that, particularly on the white goat, which gave the appearance of glitter. The curators were very curious about this, and they actually kind of thought it was the artist's intention. But I didn't quite believe that, so I set out to discover what it was. Aha, it worked. This is just me playing with a torch. I consulted with colleagues, as we do as paper conservators, for a good couple of years, actually. And nobody had ever seen or heard of such a thing. I was still questioning whether it was actually the artist's intent or whether there was something else going on. But eventually I found the right person, and that right person was an Australian colleague, paper conservator, who... and I can't mention any names, but she worked in a major institution in Australia, and they had a number of works on paper that glittered, that they kept locked away and were never shown because they were totally embarrassed about them. And I'm showing you ours. And the reason for this was that they had been treated with chloramine tea. I then had another chance bumping into Vincent Daniels in the gallery in Cardiff one afternoon, and I invited him to see my glittery goats. And with an offer like that, he couldn't refuse. I described to him what had been told to me, and I said, "Have you ever seen anything like that before?" And he said, "No, I haven't." But he did say that if I tested the material, if I could take a sample, he did tell me that I would find paratoluene sulfamide. And we're fortunate in Cardiff to have FTIR facilities, so I carefully brushed a sample, and I took it to my colleague Julian Carter, and we did indeed positively identify paratoluene sulfamide. So the only reason for its presence really is the use of chloramine tea. So, just a little, and you can see why I had to introduce that bit of film. We were warned against film, but you can't see it in a photograph. You have to really catch the light and see the play of light over the surface to appreciate all its glittery gloriness. The watercolour bears a monogram, WM or MW, and we can't find it. We can't identify it to an artist. It is basically inventoried as a British school. The frame, there's just the section of the frame there. I think it's been re-gilded. There's partial labels on the backboard, and you can see the discoloration around the circular where the slip in the frame is that's discoloured the paper. And perhaps you can also appreciate why there was more glitter on the white goat, in that there's very little medium there. There's just some highlights. So it was the white paper showing through that made the white goat. So they've obviously really concentrated on that white goat. When I removed it from the frame, it's on very thin paper, and it's attached to a Quati mount board, which I presume probably was attached in the last 30 years. There's no records that came with this bequest. The donor was known to frequent dealers and galleries in London. She lived in London. So it's difficult to know whether she bought it fully restored or whether she had it carried out herself. Those of you who are quite observant will also notice that blue sky and those white fluffy clouds is actually chalk as well. And the rest of it is pretty much all watercolour. I imagine that was actually part of this restoration as well. It had the full works, basically. Under UV light, there's also white watercolour highlights that fluoresce as lead white, but they are obviously white, so potentially they may have had some treatment as well. So although it's impossible to say when the chloramine T treatment was carried out, I think it's safe to say that it's probably, the media was quite sensitive, so they didn't really properly wash it out, rinse it out afterwards, and that's why we have this glittery material. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with chloramine T. Show of hands. Oh, I've got a few in the front. Has anybody used it? Does anybody still use it? Oh, no, nobody's admitting to that. When I was trained in conservation, it was always the hushed sort of, and there's chloramine T, but nobody told me how to use it, and certainly in studios that I've worked at, it's never been used. We use other bleaches, but not chloramine T. I did meet one conservator who is now retired who regarded it as an excellent bleach, but did give a qualifying statement that it must be rinsed out afterwards. A little potted history of chloramine T. It was first mentioned in 1937 as a mild bleaching agent, and it was first used as a disinfectant, and today it's still used for cleaning garden ponds and conservation. Blenderleith mentions its use in 1956, but he stated that it was not necessary to rinse out afterwards. More research and testing was carried out in the 1960s, and they concluded that washing was necessary. During the 1970s, Margaret Hay and Vincent Daniels, so if he'd never seen it, did a lot of research and testing with chloramine T, and Margaret Hay adamantly did not recommend it as a bleaching agent, and Vincent Daniels recommended using anti-claws to remove the last traces of the oxidizing agent before the final wash. And again, by the 1980s, Burgess also recommended using anti-claw. But by the 1980s, its use really was phased out as other agents were researched and introduced. But you do a quick Google search now, it's very cheap, you can still buy it. And it's still available for using as a bleaching agent on paper. I know they're here today, I do apologise. But it's also available in the UK in a large tub for £15, bargain. Now we can move on to the nice photographs. I've found nothing published about the glittery appearance, which probably proves that why Vincent Daniels didn't know anything about it. But I did find a reference that was published in the Journal of the American Institute of Conservation in 2001 by a group of Australian conservators from Adelaide. And they were basically looking at a white powder that they found within a frame, within a framed print. And I suppose it was sort of 9/11 time. They were suspecting that it might be a biocide and potentially toxic. So they were looking at it from another angle. And I have to thank my friend Jim, who usually takes photographs of very tiny insects and has this amazing camera set up on his microscope. He took all these photographs for me. I've also been able to, working with geologists, I've discussed crystal formation with my geology colleagues at the museum. And they've said, they've looked at these photographs, and because of the flat appearance, we can assume that the crystals were formed when the actual watercolour, the paper, was horizontal. So I'm kind of imagining that maybe a very strong solution was applied and it quickly formed this film that has then shattered, formed a film on where it had been applied and has then shattered to create these sort of crystals, this transparent material. I took this watercolour out of the frame in 2010 and I got it out of the drawer the other day. And I do believe that this material is actually breaking up more. I think it looks actually a lot smaller than it used to do. It's not quite glistening as much as it used to do five years ago. So my hypothesis is that maybe when we first received it in 2010, it was actually quite fresh and it was quite freshly formed, and that this degradation or this visible byproduct of this treatment actually goes through an aging process, and what colleagues saw as a white powder is potentially what this might turn into. So we can be aware of it being glittery, but it can also then turn into the powder. We have an SEM as well, and I got him to put some through there, but I think these photographs show it all, really. So in conclusion, although not in common use today, chloramine tea, if you put it into Google, reveals that it can still be purchased from suppliers, reputable suppliers, specifically for the use of bleaching paper. So unfortunately, this does make it available for the amateur and for those who promote themselves as conservators and restorers. As with other bleaching agents used and still being used, the effects can be damaging if the proper procedures are not followed, and this is basically what happened here. I think I can quite safely claim that this glittery appearance was not the artist's intention, and that it is a phenomenon caused by conservation intervention. I'd also like to suggest something, and I have to qualify this with, I did live in Australia for 5 years, and I am married to an Australian as well, but I'd like to suggest there might be a connection with Australia as well. Can it be coincidental that the only published research was carried out on an item in a collection in Australia, and that the only person who'd ever seen this and commented on it to me was working in another state of Australia where it had also been carried out? I'll leave that there, I don't know. But I guess it's not too hard. London is full of Australians, so it wouldn't be a far stretch of the imagination to imagine that somebody had worked in Australia and possibly London. I am married to an Australian. Sorry, David. So the glitter actually can easily be brushed away. Although I'm not sure, looking at this photo, maybe there is some more sort of really stuck into that paper surface. So I'm actually going to say something controversial here. While I'm still working at National Museum of Wales, I think I'm going to keep it in the drawer and see what happens. See if it does turn into powder. It's not really any great work of art, and unless unless the curators do want to show it, which I think actually is quite unlikely, I'll just wait and see what happens. Thank you. Diolch.